Hello, friends. Today's podcast question says, how can I foster a love for reading in my children? And now, at first glance, this may seem like a question that is out of place for the Foundation Worldview podcast because it may seem like this isn't helping our kids think critically or biblically. But if you really think about this question, it is one that fits well with the Foundation Worldview podcast because training our children to love to read is important, especially for those of us who stem from a biblical worldview. And this is important for several reasons. First is because God has revealed himself to us through his written word. And if we want our children to seek God all the days of their life, then they must know how to read, and they must know how to read God's word. In fact, when you just take a quick glance at history and the different countries in which literacy rates have drastically risen, those are countries where Christianity has spread. That Christianity has always brought with it rising rates of literacy because Christians are people of the book. And so if we want our children to be people who seek God in his word all the days of their lives, we need to help foster a love of reading. Another reason this is important from a biblical worldview is that part of fulfilling our calling as humans to fill the earth and to subdue it involves learning new things. If we are going to subdue the earth, we have to continually be learning more and more about it and how we can best harness the resources that we have here. And often when we are learning new things involves reading. So if we are being faithful to that command to fill the earth and subdue it, part of that will most likely involve reading. And then a third reason, just because of God's common grace in how he has designed our minds and has designed our minds to respond to reading, that research has revealed that there are significant health benefits from reading, that reading often helps reduce stress. It often improves sleep quality. That's why it's often suggested that you spend, 10 to 15 minutes reading before going to bed. Reading has also been found to help keep the mind sharp. That reading extensively is one of the ways to ward off mental decline. And so there's just a host of benefits for reading. And so fostering a love of reading in our children is something that we should be striving for. So that's what we're going to dive down into today on the Foundation Worldview podcast, where we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. I'm your host, Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I'm thrilled that you've joined me for this episode today. And before we get into how we can foster this love of reading in our children, if you found the content of this podcast beneficial, please make sure that you invest the few seconds that it takes to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes, and also to rate and review the content. That just helps us out with the algorithms, getting this content out to more Christian adults. Now, as we think about fostering a love of reading in our children, we cannot ultimately make our children love anything. They're going to love what they learn to love. So we cannot make sure that every child who comes from our home loves reading. But what we can do is we can put steps in place to work towards inclining them to love reading. Okay, because think about it. A child who comes from a home where they're rarely read to, where there are few books in the house, where the parent never reads, that child could grow up and love reading. It is possible. However, the chances are much less that that child is going to love reading than a child who grows up in a home where they're consistently read to, where there are books all over the place, where the child is encouraged to read, where the parents read. Now, could a child in that environment grow up and really have a distaste for reading? Yeah, they could, but there's a much greater chance. So what we want to do is we want to put steps in place to help incline our children toward a love of reading. So we're going to go through 3 distinct steps that we can systematically go through to try to foster a love of reading in our children. Now, if you are watching this podcast on YouTube, and as we go through this content, if you have things that you have done in your home to help your children foster a love of reading, please feel free to write those in the comments. I think it's always helpful to hear just from other parents, things that they have done that have really helped their children. So 3 steps to help foster a love of reading. The first one is model a love for reading. It is rare that children automatically pick up a love for something that their parents do not model having a love for. So if you want your child to love reading, make sure you have books around your house. Make sure that you are regularly reading. Now, does this mean that you have to spend tons of time reading every day? No, but keep a book by your bedside. Okay. Make sure that your children know that you value reading and why you value it. Okay. So that's the first thing, to model a love for reading. The second thing is to read with your children. Now you might think, Elizabeth, are you kidding me? I already knew this. I didn't need this podcast to hear that. And you're right. However, I just want to go through some of the benefits of reading with your children that you might not have thought of before. Now, if you have young children in the home, if you are consistently reading with them and requiring that even just for short periods of time, they sit next to you on the sofa while you are reading, you are training them in so many different things. The first thing you're training them in is just understanding how to hold a book and how to turn the pages. Recently, I was visiting a friend of mine and I was reading with her 18-month-old son. And a few days later, I saw him. He was just seated on the sofa and he was pretending to read to himself a picture book. And he knew the way to turn the pages. He knew that you go from right, okay, and then to left, that you take the page on the right side and you flip it over to the left-hand side. And that's something that if a child isn't read to from a young age, it's going to take them a while to learn that. But here, my friend's 18-month-old already knew that. Also, when children are little and they're kind of squirmy, like whether it's 18 months or, 24 months or 3 years, a lot of times they'll just jump down off the sofa in the middle of a book. Now, if you are reading a very long book, that is understandable. However, if you're reading a normal picture book, I would encourage you to say, nope, we're not done with the book yet. And just, put them back on the sofa and continue reading, because one thing that they should know is that you read through a whole picture book, or if you're reading through a chapter book, you're going to read through a whole chapter. So once kids are older, I would still encourage you to read out loud to them, because that's a way that you are going to model a love for reading and you're going to be involved in the process with them. Now, when you're reading out loud, you can go through a host of different genres. I would encourage you to let your children sometimes pick out the books that you are reading, to pick out the genre so that they can, get engaged in something that they really enjoy. I know this was something that my mom did with me and my brother and sister so well when we were growing up, that every night my sister would go to bed first because she was the youngest, then my brother would go to bed, and then I would go to bed. And for 15 minutes before each of us would go to bed, we would have what was called a special time. And this was time where we would get our mom's one-on-one attention. And more often than not, during that special time, our mom would be reading a book to us. I know that my mom and I, oh my goodness, we went through dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of chapter books together while I was growing up. And so reading out loud, that's another way to just really engage your child in the process of reading. Even if you're not a very dramatic person, it can be really helpful when you're reading if you read with some expression. And if there's different characters, try to use different voices for them. Now, if you have gone through a read aloud that your child has just absolutely loved, would you write that in the comments? Because I think it's always helpful just to get recommendations of good books from other Christian parents. So please, or just write down any recommendations that you have. Okay, so step 1 was to model a love for reading. Step number 2 was to read with your children. And then step number 3 is to set aside a time for your children to read every day. That in the busyness of life, it can get so that things such as reading just get pushed to the side. But reading has so many benefits for your children. Spiritual benefits, okay, equipping them to read God's word. It's also helping them fulfill that dominion mandate to fill the earth and subdue it. And also so many different health benefits for them. It's important to actually carve out time for reading every day. A friend of mine has done this so well with her children that her children are involved in a university model school. So they go to a school 2 days a week, and then they're homeschooled 3 days a week. And on their home days, even though her children are between the ages of 6 and 11, they still have an hour and a half to 2 hours of quiet time in their room every afternoon. And during that time, part of it is reserved for reading. Now, because she has really helped develop a love for reading in her children, sometimes her children will spend that whole hour and a half to 2 hours reading. But even if they don't spend that whole time, just part of it is reserved for reading. I have another friend who, when she puts her children to bed, she gives them a little light timer in their room, and they know that for the next 20 to 30 minutes, they are allowed to read. So it's a really special thing that, like even after they've been tucked in, they get to stay up a little bit longer. And then when it's time for them to put down the book, the color on the light changes and they put the book down, but it really helps calm their minds. It engages their mind, but it calms them down and helps them sleep. Now, when you're setting aside time for reading with your children, some children struggle to read, or some children struggle to find genres that they like to read. So a few things that you can do just to help them in this way. If your child struggles reading, I highly recommend that you go to your local library and you find their section that has playaways. And playaways are just books on MP3. And then find a playaway or two that you think your child would enjoy, and then find the corresponding book that goes along with it. And then what you can do is just give your child a set of headphones and have them listen to the book on the playaway while they are following along in the printed book. Now, this is very valuable for a child who struggles to read, because if you have let's say you have a fourth grader and they're reading at a second grade reading level, the second grade books are just going to be boring to them because they're not going to be written about topics normally that your child is interested in. So using the accompanying playaway can equip them to actually be able to read a book that is on their grade level and is of interest to them. Now, you don't want to just get out the playaway and have them just listening, because listening is an important skill, but if you don't have the accompanying book, it's not actually helping grow them as a reader. So you want to have both of those. You obviously could do the same thing with an Audible app, or, even if you just had the Libby library app with audiobooks. I do discourage parents from using those forms of audiobooks, simply because if you're having your child do this on their own, having them on Audible or on Libby requires that they have access to some kind of tablet or phone or other kind of screen. Where if you get the Playway, it is just a little box that has that MP3 alone. So that's why I highly recommend the Playways. Then if you have a child that just is an okay reader, they're reading on grade level or maybe even above grade level, but they just don't like it, make frequent trips to the library, because the children's section of your library will have so many different books. If your child doesn't like fiction, find something in science that they enjoy. If they really enjoy rocks and minerals, or they're interested in volcanoes, go to the section of the library that has all the books about volcanoes and let them check out a bunch of those books. And by making frequent trips to the library, you're going to be familiarizing yourself and your children with the library. You're going to see how many books there are. And this can, again, just help foster this love of reading in your child. Also, highly recommend that if you are not yet a member of the Foundation Worldview Book Club, that you become a member of that. Membership is free. You just give us your email address so that we can send you monthly recommendations of books that you can read with your children. Every month we send out a title for children ages 4 through 7, and then children ages 8 through 12. And those titles are always accompanied with 3 or 4 worldview-based questions that you can engage your child in to have worldview-based literature discussions. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, we cannot force our children to love anything. But what we can do is we can put steps in place to work towards inclining them to love reading. And the 3 steps that I suggested are: 1, model a love for reading; 2, read with your children; and then 3, set aside a time every day for them to read. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. But if you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you can submit that by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. And I'm so thankful for everyone who has submitted questions, because we couldn't do this podcast without you. My prayer for you as we leave our time together is that no matter the situation in which you and the children that God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of His Son. I'll see you next time.